In 1453, the expanding Ottoman Empire breached the gate to Europe. Constantinople was conquered. And soon Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror, renewed his offensive efforts. On the 4th of July 1456, he arrived at the Hungarian border fortress of Belgrade, with an army of about 40,000 men and 200 ships. This marked the beginning of a siege characterized by an unusual crusader army, a trap failing to spring, and a towering fortress. The siege of Belgrade, or in Hungarian Nándorfehérvár, ended on the 22nd of July, a day now celebrated as a national memorial day in Hungary. Just like the siege of Constantinople, this one is also somewhat controversial both from a political and historiographical standpoint. And this is a nice segue to today's sponsor, Ground News, which is a website and app that shows you how breaking news is being covered across the political spectrum. In the age of manipulative algorithms and sensationalized news content, such a service has become vital for having an informed and balanced opinion. On their website and app, Ground News provides a host of useful tools that help me understand current events from different viewpoints. For example, you can swipe between headlines to see how the same story is being framed by left, center, and right sources. But it also allows you to see which stories are underreported by the left or the right. For example, here you can see the story about Austria's leader meeting with Putin because of the ongoing war was covered more or less equally by media outlets, while the increasing cost of living in the UK is a topic that left-leaning media outlets covered more often. So it's somewhat of a blind spot for the right. If you're interested in a useful tool that helps you stay informed about current events around the world, check out Ground News by visiting ground.news/sand to download the free app. Now, let's jump back to the video. As the crescent replaced the cross on Hagia Sophia, the Ottomans were gaining a stable foothold in the Balkans. Although the fall of Constantinople caused great concern in Europe, reactions were sketchy at best. One of the few concrete undertakings was made by John Hunyadi, the Captain General of Hungary. The experienced politician and veteran of several battles against the Ottomans had been governing Hungary while the young king Ladislaus V was in the wardship of the king of the Romans, Frederick III, who in 1452 had become emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. When Frederick was finally forced to release the young king, Hunyadi resigned, but he retained the de facto power as captain general and administrator of the royal revenues. The king and his custodian, Ulrich von Zilli, made efforts to strip Hunyadi of his powers. But the aged captain general still had most of the nobility on his side and had no intentions to let go of it easily. Despite these internal quarrels, Hunyadi raised an army and prepared for an imminent Ottoman attack. When the Ottomans did indeed invade Serbia in 1454, he crossed the Danube at Belgrade with about 8,000 cavalrymen, defeated the Ottomans stationed at Kruševac, and raided Serbia and Bulgaria as far as Pirot and Vidin. This caused enthusiasm in Europe, and there were grandiose plans to throw the unwelcome invaders out of Europe. However, barely anything was put into action. In September of 1455, rumors spread that Mehmed II would launch a campaign against Moldavia or Wallachia. When Moldavia acknowledged Ottoman overlordship, pressure further increased on Hunyadi. The threat of an invasion became ever more concrete, but only in April of 1456 did King Ladislaus finally order to muster an army. It should be ready by the 1st of August. However, due to supply shortages, the recruitment was delayed until after the next harvest. This was way too late. When news arrived on the 7th of April that the Ottoman army was marching towards Hungary, the only army at hand was Hunyadi's. According to the historian Tamas Palosfalvi, it numbered some 10,000 men in March. For a long time, the exact target of the Ottoman army remained unclear, so that Hunyadi couldn't concentrate on one particular point of the long Hungarian border. He was moving in the direction of Temesvar in June and was encamped at Holos when it finally became clear. The Ottomans were marching to Belgrade. However, Hunyadi was not all on his own. A Franciscan friar from Italy by the name of Giovanni da Capestrano was preaching a crusade to rally peasants and local lords to Hunyadi's cause. After a recruiting campaign in Bohemia and Germany, he focused his efforts on southern Hungary. Even though the people probably didn't understand much of his long Latin sermons, he had considerable success. His call to resistance fell on sympathetic ears. Especially in the proximity of the Ottoman Empire, people feared Ottoman raids and were open to resistance. By early summer of 1456, Giovanni had gathered an army of about 27,000 crusaders. These peasants, merchants, and craftsmen, armed with pitchforks and axes, and filled with religious zeal and desperation fueled by the Ottoman raids, were no match for the trained Ottoman warriors. Robert Nisbet Bain, a historian and linguist, most active around 1900, issued a withering verdict. Quote, "An army, indeed, it could scarcely be called, for a sorrier band of warriors surely never came together." End quote. Besides this meager support, Hunyadi put his money on what was considered the strongest fortress on the Hungarian border, Belgrade. Belgrade was to Hungary what Constantinople was to Europe. A mighty fortress and an even more powerful symbol. The town was seen as the key to the realm, and it was, truly, a formidable nut to crack. The towering stronghold was built on a triangle-shaped promontory at the confluence of the rivers Danube and Sava. The core of its defense was the castle on top of the promontory. It was subdivided in smaller compartments, which could be defended separately. The castle could only be accessed via a singular drawbridge. A strong wall separated it from the town below, which was divided in districts as well. The steep slope of the promontory on the riverside and a double wall and a moat formed the outer lines of defense. Because of the Danube and Sava rivers, Belgrade could only be approached from the south. The fortified port at the base of the promontory, where the Danube flotilla was based, allowed to supply the town. Hunyadi had sent his brother-in-law, Mihai Shilagi, and his eldest son, Laszlo, with a hand-picked elite of his army to reinforce the garrison on the 14th of July. Thomas Paulus Falvi reckons that this augmented garrison numbered some 5,000 to 6,000 men. Additionally, Hunyadi had seen to it that the town was well provisioned. The Ottomans had chosen a crucial, but by no means an easy target. Mehmed II and his army arrived at the gates of Belgrade on the 4th of July 1456. The Sultan had spent a good part of the winter to assemble an army with greatest care. The result was an impressive force of 40,000 to 50,000 men, 200 ships and a large modern artillery contingent. These huge guns, partly even manufactured on site, were particularly impressive for eyewitnesses. According to one primary source, this army had a size, quote, "never seen by human eyes before, nor even imagined by any mind," end quote. When the Ottomans arrived, they first held a council of war on how to best approach the town. Some of the Sultan's councillors wanted to encircle the town fully, secure the hinterland, and only then begin with the siege operation. Others argued to begin with the bombardment right away and assault the town as soon as possible. The second group prevailed. Meanwhile, Hunyadi had made plans to prevent the Ottomans from taking control of the Danube by intercepting them at the junctions of the rivers Morava and Danube. On the 3rd of July, however, he learned from a letter by Giovanni Capestrano that it was already too late. Mehmed's fleet controlled the complete Danube up to Belgrade. And even worse, they had managed to pass by the walls of the fortress and install a blockade upstream of the castle. Connected by heavy chains, Ottoman ships fully shut the way down the Danube. On land, the Ottomans built a fortified camp around the promontory, which formed a belt spanning from the Danube to the Sava. Mehmed arrayed his men with care. The Rumelian Corps with most of the artillery took the right wing, the Anatolian Corps the left wing, and the Janissaries were in the center along with his command post. To secure his position and make sure the Hungarians wouldn't get in their sight, the Sipahi cavalry was patrolling the shore of the Danube. This array was clearly intended to focus all the forces on one point, and suggests that the Sultan had in mind to take Belgrade by storm. The bombardment began on the first days of July. For the next days, the Ottoman artillery battered against the walls and shot at the town almost ceaselessly. At the same time, an army of sappers set out to fill in the ditch of the town. However, the defenders were quickly at hand wherever damage was done. What the Ottoman cannons tore down during the day was repaired by the townspeople at night. With whatever material they had at hand, they constructed makeshift structures and filled in breaches. Meanwhile, the guns of Belgrade weren't silent either. They thundered forth, destroying Ottoman siege equipment, devastating emplacements, and killing attackers. Among many others, the Belgrade of Rumelia, Dai Karacha, was hit by a cannonball fired from the walls of the town. As the bombardment continued, the situation within the town quickly deteriorated. The garrison was exhausted and the townspeople terrified. The town itself riddled with ruins. Quickly, the reserves of the town emptied and food became scarce. It was a question of time until the forces would have to give in. At this moment, a soft-footed messenger managed to sneak through the Ottoman lines. He informed Hunyadi of the dire situation. Hunyadi knew he had no time to lose. As fast as possible, he prepared the flotilla he had assembled. It mainly consisted of hastily transformed merchant vessels that served as makeshift warships equipped with cannons. When the ships were finally ready, Hunyadi sent his best soldiers aboard. On the 14th of July, Hunyadi and one of his commanders marched their troops downstream on both shores, while the improvised war fleet was setting sail. Using the force of the river, they clashed into the Ottoman blockade. The garrison was informed of this, manned the Hungarian ships in the harbor of Belgrade, and attacked the back of the Ottoman fleet. At the same time, the marching men blocked both shores. For several hours, the two fleets fought on the river, and fierce hand-to-hand combat was raging, while the cannons aboard tried to sink the enemy ships. After a long struggle, the lighter and quicker Hungarian ships finally managed to encircle the Ottomans. Their crews were butchered and many drowned while trying to swim to safety. The river blockade was dispersed and the way to Belgrade stood wide open. Hunyadi ordered supplies to be brought to the harbor as quickly as possible, and he himself entered the town on the 15th of July with battle-hardened reinforcements. The relief of the besieged townspeople was immeasurable. Meanwhile, Capistrano's crusaders took position on the left bank of the Sava to prevent the Ottomans from crossing the river. Seeing this, the Sultan realized he was in trouble. His strategy of focusing all forces between the rivers hadn't paid off, because it left too much room for maneuvers to his enemies. Both banks of the Danube and the left bank of the Sava were completely left to them, and now that the river blockade was destroyed, they could easily bring reinforcements and supplies to the fortress. But it was too late to make good for the omission of a complete encirclement. The Ottomans had no choice but to stick to their plan. They continued the bombardment for 5 more days and intensified their efforts to fill in the ditch. But now, an invisible enemy was striking out against both defenders and besiegers. Some sort of plague, which had been raging in the region even before the siege, was spreading in the town and the camp. It took many lives, but neither the defenders nor the attackers could take a break. When the deafening clamor of the Ottoman guns eventually stopped, Hunyadi knew all too well what this meant. An assault was imminent. In the evening of the 21st of July, the Ottomans sounded their drums. The infantry, tightly followed by the Janissaries, advanced and pushed towards the walls. It's hard to fully explain the unfolding events because the source material has a strong pro-Christian bias and portrays the fight as an overly heroic struggle. Most of the sources report that the bombardment had completely devastated the walls and Hunyadi himself compared the bombarded castle to a plane. This is, however, massively exaggerated for sure, and modern historians even doubt that the Ottoman cannons were able to open a breach in such a short period of time. From a narrative perspective, the loss of much of their defenses makes the struggle of the defenders look even more heroic. Bereft of any protection, they bravely stand against the waves of attackers, so to speak. Be that as it may, somehow the Ottomans made it into the town at several points. Hunyadi had withdrawn his best men from the outer walls into the citadel. There, he was preparing a surprise for his Ottoman guests. When they, motivated by the easy triumph over the outer walls, headed for the citadel, Hunyadi and his men sallied forth. Some accounts even report that the men on the outer walls had lit a fire along the defenses on the inside to separate the advancing troops from their following comrades. This is certainly plausible, but impossible to confirm. After a long struggle, Hunyadi claimed it went on for the whole night. The Ottomans retreated. Although their losses were not too heavy, they had suffered two massive blows. Firstly, they became aware of the strength of the Belgrade citadel. Secondly, a fire had destroyed the huge shed in the Ottoman camp where the wagons and ropes had been stored. This made it impossible to move the artillery. Without too many options left, the Sultan turned his attention to his stratagem. Mehmed ordered his cavalry to retreat. As the crusaders on the outer walls realized that the tents and the artillery had been abandoned, some of them were lured out of the town by the tempting prospect of plunder. Hunyadi, who was aware of the risk of leaving the safety of the walls, had strictly forbidden anyone to move forward. He knew his men would stand no chance in an open field battle. However, it was not long until the crusaders from the opposite bank of the Sava began to cross the river and joined the ensuing looting. Once the crusaders had taken to pillaging the camps, the Ottomans launched themselves on the poorly equipped and untrained men and, quote, killed them all the way to the earthworks, end quote. In spite of his own reservations, Hunyadi decided to join the fight and sallied forth with his cavalry to charge the rear of the Ottoman army. Now the Sultan had got what he had wished for, an open field battle. Unfortunately for him though, nothing went according to plan. The cavalry sent away by Mehmed did not return in time. The blow from the back surprised the Ottoman infantry, and they retreated to the fortified camp. There the fight came to a climax. Mehmed himself joined the melee, but after a while he took an arrow to the thigh and left the field of battle wounded. The fight raged on until late afternoon, when some of the cavalry sent away by the Sultan finally returned and stabilized the Ottoman lines. At this point, however, it was too late. The Hungarian victory was in no way decisive, but the Ottoman defeat made it evident that the siege could not be continued. The defenders carried away whatever guns they managed to move and made all the others unusable. Wounded and deprived of his trump card, the artillery, Mehmed gave order to break camp. The Ottoman army departed before the first light on the 23rd of July. Belgrade was saved. These events not only stopped the advance of the Ottomans for the time being, but were also very important symbolically. Rejoicing echoed through Europe, for the successful defense of Belgrade shook the rising myth of Ottoman invincibility. In this spirit, Hunyadi wanted to go on the offensive and repulse the Ottomans from the Balkans. However, on the 11th of August, before his ambitious plans were set in motion, the aged warrior succumbed to the plague. Soon his brother-in-arms, Giovanni Capistrano, followed him into the grave. The Ottomans and the Hungarians, however, were to remain two unhappy neighbors.